Good morning to the August intellectual gathering. I am Dr. C.G. Sangeetha, Assistant Professor of English, Sri Sarada College for Women, Tamil Nadu. I feel pride to anchor the first session of 19th Annual and 5th International Science Fiction Conference 2020. Gaining knowledge is the first step to wisdom. Sharing it is the first step to humanity. This virtual platform provides an opportunity to share our knowledge across the world. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all for the 19th Annual and 5th International Science Fiction Conference 2020 in collaboration with Bangalore University. It's my privilege to introduce the Indian Association for Science Fiction Studies in this great forum. Indian Association for Science Fiction Studies was established on Asimov's birthday on January 2, 1998. This non-profitable association is registered under Karnataka Societies Registration Act. The objectives of the association are to provide material and guidance to students who would pursue their research for their master's and doctoral degrees in the field of science fiction, and to provide a platform for the science fiction enthusiast to share their views in the form of presenting papers during the annual conferences. The association had begun to collaborate with many colleges, universities, local bodies, and institutions in organizing conferences. Hence, it could bring together hundreds of academicians, scholars, scientists, writers, publishers, critics, movie makers, journalists, fans, webmasters, industrialists, technologists, farmers, and readers. So far, the annual conferences were held at Chennai, Coimbatore, Gandhigram, Kudiyatham, and Vellore in Tamil Nadu, Bangalore, Elahati, and Mysore in Karnataka, Varanasi in Uttar Pradesh, Aurangabad and Pune in Maharashtra, Pondicherry, a Union Territory, and Ernakulam in Kerala. Under the roof of Indian Association for Science Fiction Studies, innumerable ideas are springing up anew. Today, under this single roof, we all come together to explore science with a literary flair. The plenary session 1 is being chaired by Dr. K.S. Purushothaman sir. The special lecture, The Future is Here, is delivered by Dr. John Rolacco. And the second special lecture, Hieroglyphs and Dystopias, Inspiring the Future, is delivered by Julie Novakova. Let me introduce the chairperson, Dr. Purushothaman sir. He started his teaching career in 1973 as a lecturer in a junior college in Karnataka. He moved to Tamil Nadu Government Collegiate Service as an assistant professor of English in 1975. Retired as grade 1 principal in 2009. Post-retirement, he had served as principal and visiting faculty in various colleges. He is one of the earliest researchers in science fiction studies in India, starting with an MPhil on Ray Bradbury in 1979 and a PhD on Asimov in 1990 from Madras University. He launched Indian Association for Science Fiction Studies in 1998 and managed to bring together science fiction writers and scholars through 18 annual conferences till date held all over India. He was also a 2-term president and a 5-time General Secretary of the Indian Association for American Studies. He has guided MPhil and PhD scholars. After more than 4 decades of teaching service, he is settled at Vellore, Tamil Nadu. He continues to help aspiring science fiction research scholars and enthuse students to take up science fiction studies and creative writing through lectures, workshops, seminars, and academic gatherings. Welcome you, sir. Next, I introduce Dr. John Raloho. He was raised in the US, completed his PhD in electrical engineering in New Zealand, taught graduate classes in South Korea, and now he is working in Singapore. His research interests are brain-computer interface, acoustics, military history, and life support. He has published on brain-to-brain interfaces, full-body prosthetics, forensics for 3D printing, and preserving historical artifacts with 3D scanning. He publishes Ombak magazine. He received postdoctoral research fellowship at University of Texas, San Antonio, and Vanderveer Institute doctoral scholarship. He investigated methods to automatically detect non-stationary spectral features in EEG. He designed, fabricated, and delivered a batch of full-body prosthetic prototypes for animal subjects to a collaborator's lab. He implemented a modular software toolset including a range of feature reduction and classifier structures for EEG-based detection of microsleep events. He proposed a digital complementary currency pegged to New Zealand dollar for universal basic income and oversaw deployment of software prototype. He designed a computer model of a 3D printed double action revolver for forensic investigation and simulated frame deformations resulting from cartridge firing. He designed a virtual machine driven by two independent EMG biosignals, and the list continues. We are eagerly waiting to view your futuristic vision. Welcome you, sir. The second guest speaker is Julie Novakova from Czech Republic. She is an evolutionary biologist at the Faculty of Science, Charles University, currently pursuing the unresolved question of the evolution of altruism in her PhD studies. She also teaches an elementary astrobiology class and has written several articles which have featured in Clarksville magazine along with many other renowned platforms. Having issued her first novel at the mere age of 17, she has gone on to publish 7 more novels, an anthology, a short story collection, and over 50 short stories. As a science fiction writer and translator, receives 3 Aeronautilus Awards, the Czech Academy of Science Fiction, Fantasy and Horrors Award, and the European Science Fiction Society's Encouragement Award. The world came to know about the term robot through Czech writer Karel Čapek. Thus, science fiction and Czech Republic have a great association. This virtual forum is awaiting to hear an inspiring speech from the Czech Republic. Welcome you, ma'am. Let us all utilizing this opportunity and relish the grand literary feast. Thank you.
Il futuro a adesso. The future is now. Just what is that appeal of the future? Why do so many people look towards the future rather than the present? I'm going to discuss that, as well as a few of the standard tropes and ideas from science fiction, and how those stack up against reality. But first, what is the promise of the future? Tomorrow will be better. The problem is that future events are often shaped by current ones, but also futurist and sci-fi writers often have the bias of the present, meaning that today's circumstances are going to be just like that in the future. This is something you'll find all throughout the course of social science. Here I've cited a book called The Third Wave by the futurist Alvin Toffler. One of Toffler's theses is that there's different waves that have shaped the course of civilization. The first wave being agriculture, the second wave being the Industrial Revolution, and the third wave being the Information Age. So, this book was written back in the 70s, early 80s, and I'd like to discuss just how accurate some of those predictions have been or have not been. Either way, I think reading older futurists is entertaining just from a modern perspective because you can see the bias in a lot of the older works. This idea of predicting the future from the present and from the past is a pretty old one. From Bronze Age prophets all the way up to modern social science. Here's a few of the famous or infamous examples. The first one, Decline of the West by Oswald Spengler. This one helped shape philosophy and social science, and a lot of literary figures as well, for a couple of decades. Decline of the West was written in the wake of World War I, when essentially most of the European order ceased to exist. Empires that existed for centuries, like Imperial Russia, Austro-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, all gone overnight. Plus there was new radical ideologies: socialism, anarchism, fascism. So, in his mind, it basically was the decline of the West. Now, another one is Future Shock by Alvin Toffler. I've already discussed his third wave, but Future Shock was kind of the book that put him on the map. The whole premise of his book Future Shock is that the change of pace of society and of daily life was getting more and more complex because there's so much information. How do you determine what's relevant? The result is that people are going to be put through a period of future shock, a period of unmooring of previous biases, and the reality we see is not necessarily going to be the reality that we build for ourselves. The third one is the fourth turning. This has been most influential in the recent presidential election because Donald Trump's main political advisor at the time, Steve Bannon, was influenced by this book. Now, I have my criticisms of this book because Strauss and Howe were ad men before they went into the whole social science, but the whole idea of social cycle theory really starts with Toffler. But if you really want to get into it, you can go all the way back to Max Weber and some of the forerunners of sociology. And again, each of these is shaped by present biases. But also, they influence aesthetics, popular culture, as well as the policies and more serious philosophies of the day. Now, one movement in particular, one that's kind of the granddaddy of the rest, the Italian Futurist, also known as Futurismo, from the early 20th century. The amount of influence these guys have had is pretty unreal. Their influence goes all the way across the political and artistic spectrum. A bit of background for you is that Italy was one of the last of the great powers in Europe that was unified. It had the industrial north and the agrarian south. And as a result, there was almost overnight radical social change. People who had lived on small farms in Sicily for generations suddenly have automobiles and airplanes. And this is before considering World War I and the stuff that would follow. Now, Mussolini kind of came into this environment in the early 20s and beforehand, exploiting this sense of unmooring, this future shock of the era. And this also is reflected in art, in science, and so on. So the Italian futurist had an influence that was far beyond their original artistic visions. They loved the automobile and they loved the airplane because they were modern and they were fast and they weren't bound by the traditions that had shaped the country for centuries before. So, some examples. Art Deco architecture. Ironically, capitalist robber barons and the wealthiest of the New World and Old World alike found the whole retro-futuristic appeal of Art Deco. You combine a bit of the monuments of antiquity with streamlined, sleek modern shapes. The futurist influence wasn't just architecture. They influenced surrealism, Dadaism, constructivism on the art scene. They influenced fascism through the idea of fusing the ideals of antiquity with a modern industrial society. They also influenced the Russian futurists, who had some of their ideas assimilated by the Bolsheviks. Interestingly, there was a current of Russian futurism that preceded the Italian one called Cosmism, and some of their ideas were assimilated by the early Soviet Union. They even had this crazy idea of putting Lenin in a cryogenic tube in Red Square, but they didn't have the technology or the resources at the time, so they just embalmed him there instead. But to do that would have really been a propaganda coup, because it would state that the party had command of life, death, and resurrection, which before was just the command of religion. Now, getting to science fiction and speculative fiction, that also reflects the concerns of its era. And where do a lot of people get influence from this? When they're young, or oftentimes when they're looking for escapist stuff as adults. So, an example of this would be H.P. Lovecraft. In particular, his Cthulhu mythos stories. One of the most famous of these is At the Mountains of Madness, which is about a collapsed alien city in Antarctica that's found by explorers millions of years after most of the inhabitants and creatures are all dead, but some of them aren't, as you can see from the title here. But this was influenced by the idea of rise and fall of civilizations that Spengler and those who have read his works really interpreted. Now, how did some of these other ideas of the classic future turn out? This is the whole rhetorical question. It's the future. Where's my jetpack? A lot of us in the scientific community like to think that our particular work is as important for the human race as space travel was during the Cold War. But keep in mind that during the Cold War, space programs were the exception rather than the norm. In the Cold War, there was the strategic reason of trying to build better rockets that could be translated into missiles and satellites for advantage in the Cold War. But there are some constraints, sadly, that keep us down here on Earth. Two big ones being cosmic radiation and life support. Because to move beyond the moon, we would need to be in space for months, if not longer. So you need a lot of radiation shielding, and it's very expensive to put that on your ship. Because we have a giant unshielded nuclear fusion reactor blasting radiation across the solar system here. So even if you have enough life support to get to Mars or Venus, good luck treating all those tumors. However, orbital spaceflight is becoming much more accessible, and not just for rockets. Here's an example. There's the invention called the Raccoon, which is basically using a weather balloon with essentially a glorified missile or mini rocket attached to it to launch microsatellites. The weather balloon goes up to a certain height, deploys the rocket for the final ascent, and then it deploys a series of small satellites. So these kind of technologies have been around for decades, and they're going to get much more accessible. This is the beginning, I hope, of a theme which will dominate the rest of this conversation. So, what about flying cars? We've had these for almost a century. One of the problems is that they're not very good at being aircraft, and they're not very good at being cars. Because most of the time, there's some kind of small light car attached to fold-out wings, or some kind of attachment to a regular car, so you drive it to an airfield and take off. Now, there have been some modern revisions, like the idea of helicars, vertical takeoff and landing for urban areas, for like ride-sharing services, but in both cases, there's serious safety considerations, because if a regular car breaks down, you pull it off the side of the road. But if a flying car breaks down, hope you got a parachute on hand. Now, jetpacks. These have been around for almost a century. Most of their use has been for promotional stunts, They don't have much military application because they're very fragile, they're very noisy, and they can only stay aloft for a short period of time, and you're better off just using a drone or aircraft observers than a guy with a very precarious device that'll drop him like a rock once the fuel runs out. This is a British guy, an inventor who built his own. It's really fancy and really impressive, but the guy is pretty brave for stepping into that thing. Again, safety being the big concern. Now, how about robots? Keep in mind that for the last 50 years, arguably, the biggest advances in robotics haven't necessarily been physical ones like automatons or glorified human-like robots, but cognitive automation, software bots. The things that send you spam could one day be the things that help direct traffic, help control smart cities, help prescribe different treatments for healthcare, for instance. So the forerunner of modern robots, at least the perception of them, is right here. Uh, Electro, made by the Westinghouse company back in the 30s. This thing could basically operate with an early form of voice recognition and detecting different wavelengths of light, but overall was just a giant showpiece for the World's Fair more than a serious device. Now, down here you see their modern descendants, Boston Dynamics. But the problem that keeps physical robots is the power supply. Internal combustion engines require fuel, lithium-ion batteries require energy, and both of them tend not to have very good energy density or duration, so it's always been a trade-off between the two. Now, how about lasers and death rays? The problem is that lasers suffer from atmospheric bloom, meaning that a laser has to burn through the water vapor in the atmosphere, losing energy in the process. That's why lasers aren't very useful for long-range death rays, but they are useful for, say, point defenses, shooting down incoming debris. That's why the US Navy was looking at them for warships and shooting down incoming projectiles. They have more uses in physics, medicine, research. They've been great for the whole field of optics, for all sorts of instrumentation. But again, the thing that keeps us from having Star Wars is direct energy weapons are limited by power supplies, and these are similar for magnetic accelerators, like coil guns and rail guns. Coil guns use a series of coils to accelerate a projectile, and they have a single-digit mechanical efficiency, like for every joule of kinetic energy, you need to put in 100 times that much in terms of current. Now, for rail guns, work a little bit differently, but they still need to be updated and have their rails replaced after every few shots because of all the current melting the bits of rails off after each discharge. So if you had a room temperature superconductor, you could make all of these practical, but until that happens, we're going to probably stick with old kinetic energy stuff for most military applications. Now, how about cryogenics? The whole idea of freezing tissue and reanimating it. A lot of this was science fiction, until relatively recently. Now keep in mind that small tissue level samples, like embryos and such, have been frozen and thawed out without much issue. It's just for larger tissues, you have other issues like ice crystals form, which can damage the tissue. The cryoprotectants, like CPA, can be toxic to the cells, and thawing it out without damaging it has always been a bit of a challenge. But thanks to a new approach that uses magnetic induction with nanoparticles, it's already being adapted for preserving organs for transplant. This is not quite cryogenics, but there was an American researcher who managed to take dead pig brains, ones that have been clinically dead for about 36 hours, put them in a life support device, and they partially revived. Not enough to grant them full awareness, but enough for the tissues to start doing some small repairs and such. So let's just say the definitions of clinical death, in light of not only cryonics, but these breakthroughs, might get a little interesting in coming years. So how about that other favorite science fiction trope, genetic engineering? Well, That just gets cheaper and more accessible every year. In fact, it's so accessible there's entire communities of hobbyists around the world. In the US, the UK, Europe, Australia, all across Asia, even in Singapore, at least for a time. This means that medical research and some of the overhead required is going to get cheaper and cheaper. Now, this has both good and potentially some scary applications. Now, I personally think that over the next few years, you're going to see more and more hobbyists or more attempts to make open source pharmaceuticals or open source biotech compared to stuff that would normally need to be patented or dominated by a few large pharmaceutical companies. You might start seeing open source generics or biosimilars compared to extremely expensive proprietary drugs. Keep in mind that there have been AIs, and in fact, I think it was a recent research paper where there was the first attempt to find a drug solely through an AI that would look through old research papers, and that drug's in testing right now. So that kind of system is going to become more and more common. Likewise, I think that the accessibility of doing things, good or ill, is going to increase regardless of what a lot of governments would like to think otherwise. An example would be the first case of human genetic engineering in China. That is still a story that is in progress, but it is an example of what is probably going to be coming down the pike, like it or not. Now, how about cyborgs? Now, of course, the term cyborg depends on who you ask. The original definition of cybernetic organism referred to a combination of a human with a life support device, like a pilot on a plane or an astronaut in a spacesuit, that work together to accomplish their mission. Now, wearable exoskeletons and their application in military medicine have been researched for years. An example would be the Talos suit that was recently investigated by the U.S. Army. The Tactical Assault Light Operator suit, I think the acronym went. But the issue again, power supply. Now, to go into a more classic kind of cyborg, like Ghost in the Shell or RoboCop, you basically have a brain or some key organs kept alive by a mechanical life support system and a bionic body driven around by a brain-computer interface. So keep in mind that brain-computer interfaces, at least ones driven by non-invasive electrodes, are made by hobbyists routinely nowadays, like the OpenBCI, the Emotive, and so on. So you would just combine that with a mobile life support system, maybe even a wheelchair with a ventilator, if you really want to get technical. So something more exotic, though, like a RoboCop-style artificial body or a full-body prosthetic, was tested back in 2017 using a small little 3D printed artificial body with rat organs transplanted into it. But the problem was the life support. The rat died of a blood clot about an hour afterwards. Keep in mind that with the best of artificial life support for humans, we have a 50% mortality rate because of how complex the procedure is. Interestingly, artificial organs are going to keep developing, I think, in coming years because cardiovascular diseases kill about a third of the world's population, and they're the leading cause of death in the United States right now, about 500,000 people a year. So there's demand for artificial hearts, which have been around since the Jarvik 7 in the 1970s at the University of Utah, and artificial lungs, which are coming out in coming years. Now, combine these two together and make it reliable, have a good power supply, because you're probably going to want that functional for your artificial body, and I think you're on the route to having something like a Ghost in the Shell full-body prosthetic. Also, interestingly, this is some of the requirements needed for artificial wombs. So, if you can provide the fetus the materials it's going to need, a way to add nutrients and remove waste, not only can it be applied to adult life support, but also for what's called ectogenesis or artificial wombs. So, how about hive minds? Collective conscious, all of that. Arguably, we are already hive minds of a sort. Each part of our brain contributes to how we act and function around other people. there is a couple of cases of patients under anesthesia for part of their brain. They have changes in personality that vanish once the anesthesia wears off. So we are already at this more than the sum of our parts. Now, as far as direct brain-to-brain interfacing between living beings, first was done on rats in Miguel Nicolelis' lab years ago. He's a very famous Brazilian neuroscientist. Now, non-invasive brain-to-brain interfacing was performed between 3 humans back in 2018. This basically means you just wear a funny headset that stimulates your brain and records your brain signals, and you can send stimulation controls or thoughts to someone else. Now, in this paper, it uses transcranial magnetic stimulation with EEG. It uses a magnetic field to stimulate different parts of the brain and different patterns in the EEG to control the signals that would be sent to the other people in the system. Basically, they use it to play Tetris. So what makes this whole thing interesting is the potential for improving cognitive performance in teams. It could be, say, security guards looking at different parts of a monitor, esports and gamers trying to look at different parts of a screen, stuff like that. The system being non-invasive, of course, is the icing on the cake, because what if someone makes a consumer version of this and then you have people stimulating parts of the brain for pain, for pleasure, and for other purposes, shall we say? Things could get very interesting very quick. The effective information transfer rate, meaning the ability to send information and its total bandwidth, in this experiment was really low, about 72 bits per minute if you really want to be generous with how you calculate it. That might sound like a lot, but you typing on the keyboard is about 2,000 or 3,000 bits per minute. So these have a long way to go. Now, you could make the device invasive, meaning you implant microchips into people's skulls, like Elon Musk wants to do, but that, again, is a ways off. So, to wrap it up, social changes shape our perception of the future, and thus our perceptions of technology. And cultural depictions of technology will influence those cultural policies. It's true in the Cold War, true in 1900s Italy, true today. Technologies that have been niche or obscure for decades are now going to get more and more accessible, whether we like it or not. I think as a society, we should try to lower the barriers of entry as much as possible and make these technologies available to as many as we can, so we can truly advance our society by capturing more people's creativity with it. The future is now. Il futuro adesso. Any questions?
Have you ever realized how science fictional our present really is? I mean, we're surrounded by things like autonomous cars, virtual reality, genetically modified humans even, or artificial intelligence that accompanies us every day in our Google searches, or for example, in aiding doctors in medical advice, since we're here at the Faculty of Medicine. And one reason why we might not realize this is that some of these things are still rare. I mean, I'm here in person right now, but I could just as well be presenting via hologram or via a remotely controlled robot. It's possible nowadays, but it's still rare. These technologies are usually only used by the tech-savvy or by the rich. Like the famous author William Gibson said, the future is already here, just not very evenly distributed. And this may be one reason why we rarely realize how advanced the world has become. Another reason is that we may have become accustomed to these technologies thanks to science fiction. We've all seen it before in SF, before these things, appeared in reality. So, does it mean that science fiction has the power to predict the future? I wouldn't say so. Let's look at the moon landings. Before 1969, when they actually happened, lots of stories featured travel to the moon. Already in the medieval Japan, the tale of the bamboo cutter showed the story of a bamboo princess which came from the moon and then returned there on her chariot. Or the astronomer Johannes Kepler's novel Somnium also featured travel to the moon. But these stories and so many other ones have nothing realistic in them. They are similar to Marco Polo's tales of travel to the Far East. It's mostly just imagination. To get some realistic portrayals of space travel, we have to go to the 20th century. After rocket pioneers such as Konstantin Tsiolkovsky already laid out the basics for actual space travel, and Tsiolkovsky even imagined how humans might one day live in space habitats and in microgravity. So the theory was already here before it got into fiction. And afterwards came the application. So something similar can be seen in most cases. Let's take, for example, ubiquitous surveillance. It was shown in George Orwell's 1984, and we've gotten the technology to get this big brother only later. But even before that, in the French Revolution, agents of Robespierre, without any advanced technology, were feared for their power of surveillance. So it was nothing new. Orwell just took it a bit further, and then it became reality, although he wouldn't probably be happy about it. And we might see something similar in most cases. So science fiction doesn't really seem to predict the future, but it can do something more important, I would argue. It can influence it, inspire it. If we return to space travel, look at these guys, Elon Musk and Jim Bezos. Both of them read science fiction when they were small children, and they both said that they were inspired by it to actually pursue the dream of space travel and make it real. They decided not to wait for national space agencies to get humans to Mars or return to the moon after the Apollo exploration has ended. They actually set out to achieve these goals themselves, and judging by the successes of their companies SpaceX and Blue Origin, even if we disregard the recent Crew Dragon accident, they are in a good way to actually achieve these dreams as private founders of these companies. And sometimes the inspiration is more direct. Here we see the first flip phone, one of the first mobile phones ever. And do you see the similarity with Star Trek's communicator? I certainly do. And so did Motorola's engineers. They even named the phone StarTech in honor of Star Trek as the inspiration source. And speaking of Star Trek, we're getting to a bit further way how science fiction can inspire the future, a more important way than just inspiring mobile phone design. Seeing this picture, we can probably find nothing out of the order with it, nothing peculiar. But in the 1960s, when the Star Trek original series was aired, this was a bit strange because we're seeing Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura, both officers working on the bridge of a starship of the Enterprise. And it's the 60s. It's the age of rampant racism and gender discrimination. And here we have a black woman, an officer on the bridge of a starship, shown as capable, competent, intelligent, and more than capable of facing the challenges that the crew gets every day. So in this way, Star Trek was paving the way for a more just and equal future. And in one of the episodes, it even featured one of the first interracial kisses on TV between Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura. And much later, in the 1980s and 90s, it got a bit further with the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. It showed us a future without money, but not communistic, as we would call it, but more like a post-scarcity society, where money is no longer needed, where science and technology and the pursuit of knowledge have enabled us to create a better future for everyone involved. And in Deep Space Nine, it then featured one of the first lesbian kisses on TV. So again, one more step for a more equal social future. So science fiction may be viewed as the source of inspiration, not just for science and technology, where it can get people to actually pursue STEM careers, but also in social change. But is it still doing this job, or is it past its prime? Because this famous science fiction author, Neil Stevenson, has argued in his 2011 article Innovation Starvation that science fiction is no longer creating these big popular images that stick in people's minds. He dubbed them hieroglyphs, and he cited the rocket, or the robot, or the atom as examples of this. Hieroglyphs tended to stick in people's minds and made them more prone to create real examples of such things. And science fiction before the wars, showing us space travel and autonomous cars and other great technological advancements, may have helped the public's view of the Apollo program or other technological advancements that actually happened in reality. But in Stevenson's view, it has stopped doing this. And he said that we should return to this golden age, or rather make a new one, create new hieroglyphs for people to pursue. Later, an anthology, Dept hieroglyph, was created, but even so its authors concluded that it actually didn't achieve this dream. One of the authors, James Cambias, said that while the stories were all engaging and full of great technology and science, they didn't create new images such as the ones Stevenson had cited before. But he also said that it's not important, that it doesn't matter, because the actual power of science fiction is the indirect inspiration. It's the showing people that science and technology are cool and that we can create a better future with science, with tech, or with social change, and that this is more than sufficient. So, is that it? Is science fiction our indirect inspirational source? Great, and that's the end of it? Not really, because there can be a much greater possibility. Not only that science fiction doesn't create new hieroglyphs, but that it may actually draw us away from the pursuit of knowledge or from achieving these great goals. Because a lot of fiction shows us easy solutions. Just think of all the times you've seen in science fiction on TV or movies when Earth was facing an imminent threat, a great problem, and there was this one scientist who stepped in and saved the day in a matter of hours, days, or weeks at most. This is really unrealistic, but it tends to create this image of a single scientist saving the day and making everything better, while actual science is hard work. It's painstaking work that takes years and that takes teams of dozens or hundreds of people, not one genius usually. And by showing us these easy solutions, it may make us less prone to do something about real threats nowadays, because why cycle instead of drive to work and try to cut our carbon emissions, when in the future we can shield the Earth from part of the sunlight, or engineer weather and climate, or when we can possibly achieve nature-friendly fusion power in 50 years at most. And it doesn't matter that we have said 50 years ago that fusion power is 50 years in the future, and it's still 50 years in the future. But science fiction can create this type of thinking that we don't have to do anything. Technology will in the end save the day. So it might make us more oblivious instead of more hardworking in creating this kind of better future. And also, a lot of science fiction is this topic, showing us these catastrophic futures, totalitarian regimes, and so on. And instead of warning us against them, it may be making us accustomed to these images of a future we don't want. Just look at Orwell's 1984. It was a warning against totalitarian governments, against the rise of strongmen as leaders, against mass surveillance. And look at the present. Strongmen are rising politically in the US, here, and in Hungary and many other countries. And mass surveillance is on the rise too. We're giving up our most intimate personal data, and we're getting easy access to the internet. We can share pictures on social media. We can even get our 2 minutes hate on social media if we want. So 1984 gave us the language to speak about this. Big Brother, 2 minutes hate, and so on, or Newspeak. It can remind us of fake news and such things, but it didn't succeed in preventing this kind of future. So, what is the actual role of science fiction? Is it this kind of hieroglyph creating panacea that can make us achieve these great things, or is it indirect inspiration for scientists and engineers, or is it this just escapist fiction making us oblivious to the real world? Well, like most complex questions, there's no easy answer to this one. It depends on the type of fiction and, of course, on the type of reader. And we can never create just science fiction that is inspirational, because we would be constraining the genre. Luckily, we still live in a free society, and we can write and tweet whatever we want. But as readers and as authors, we can pick the type of fiction that can hopefully inspire us to pursue a better future. And as a biologist by study and as a science fiction writer, I am directly inspired by science in creating science fiction stories. And when I read a new scientific paper, for example, on the origin of song in zebra finches, or on pulsar emissions in distant galaxies, it often makes me create stories around these scientific facts, and then people may actually learn the facts while reading the fiction. And hopefully, I don't know this, but I can certainly hope, by reading this, they can think, wow, I want to do this too. I want to become a scientist because it's great, it's cool, I will be learning new things, I will be advancing humanity's knowledge, and hopefully one day getting us to the stars. And we certainly need people capable of adapting to the challenges of the future world and pursuing big dreams such as finding alien life. The European Space Agency is sending its ExoMars mission to Mars in just a few years, and NASA will send its 2020 Mars rover as well. And these will search for signs of life in the past or potentially in the present. We have learned that Mars has Marsquakes. That means it's not geologically dead. It may have still some active hydrothermal vents or volcanoes where isolated conditions for life might potentially exist. And that's not the only place to search for life in the solar system. We have the icy moons, such as Jupiter's Europa or Saturn's Enceladus, which also featured in fiction from A.C. Clarke up until now. And these moons, underneath the thick icy crust, have subsurface water oceans that will likely have conditions for life. We don't know this yet, but we have to go there and we have to find out. And it's up to the next generation of scientists and engineers of space probes to achieve this. But it's also up to the public to support this dream, up to the policymakers and politicians to value learning, value knowledge, and to see how even going into the outer space can help us in battling the challenges here on Earth right now, because technology from space can help us prevent more global warming or help poor people, and we don't know yet where it will take us. So we have to just keep advancing and see. So this is my message. Don't ever lose your imagination. If you like science fiction, go on reading it, and please be inspired to create a better future, because it's up to you. It's up to single one of us. Thank you.
Hello. Greetings from the Indian Association for Science Fiction Studies on this 19th annual conference and the 5th international conference. I'm really indebted to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. K.R. Venugopal, for giving this opportunity for us to collaborate with us to organize this wonderful, very unique virtual conference. In fact, ever since the launch of the Indian Association for Science Fiction Studies in 1998 by me, we have had a very checkered history trying to organize various conferences at various parts of the country. And especially now, this particular conference of Bangalore University is an historical event for us. In fact, I can say that this is a milestone in the history of science fiction studies in India. Actually, right from the beginning, we have had to worry about funding, finding accommodation, and of course, most importantly, finding participants. Because in those days, when particularly, let us say, when I started my science fiction studies in 1978, there was hardly anyone who knew what science fiction was. So every time I presented a paper at some seminar or conference, I used to beat a lonely path. Like what Robert Frost said, the road not taken. So I had taken this road, which had never been even heard of or seen by most academicians in India. While it was a great event like this particular conference, there was still a lot of demand for academic enterprise. It was sometime, let us say, in the last 4 or 5 years that we have found extremely good response from participants, from research scholars, and most importantly, from writers and critics. This happened because we found that by including Indian science fiction, particularly in the last 10 years or so, we find that science fiction participation in seminars, conferences, in research projects, in MPhil and PhD research is very encouraging, because we find that the Indian perspective, the Indian contribution to science fiction has been tremendously improving over the last decade or so. Particularly the 21st century has been a very encouraging period or era for us. For example, when I started doing research, I had to depend only on Western scholars, Western authors, with very few people in India, like Jayant Narlikar, Bal Ponke, Sujata Rangarajan in Tamil, and like this. Only a handful, and their creative output was also very restricted to their particular localities. But today we find, at least in the perspective of the Indian Association for Science Fiction Studies, a lot of availability of material. More than that, equally a great awareness for the potential of research in science fiction. This is what has brought us into this present context. Now today, this particular conference, with its online feature, has brought in a number of people, both writers and scholars, which is very encouraging, and I am sure that in the future there is going to be a great deal more attention paid to science fiction writing as well as scholarship. So that way I am very much indebted once again to the Vice Chancellor of Bangalore University, Dr. K.R. Venugopal, and his industrious team of scholars, professors from various departments who have made this conference a grand success. Now coming to the two lectures that are being presented to us here. One is by John LaRocco, who is an American working in Singapore, and his talk is on the future is now, the promise of science fiction. Now this is what we find an extremely useful talk, because he explores the various aspects of futurism with particular reference to the various tropes, the various thematic concerns of science fiction, starting from, let us say, the space flight, from flying cars to robots to cryogenics to bioengineering and so on, and ultimately conclude by saying that the future is right here and now. So it's a very interesting and a scholarly presentation that gives us a very broad and an in-depth perspective on the future concerns of science fiction and how it can be good for us for the future of humanity. The second talk is by Julie Novakova, who is talking about hieroglyphs and dystopias inspiring the future. So science fiction, she finds, is not merely a creative expression of various writers, but is actually an inspiration that allows new developments in the future. And by using that subtitle, hieroglyphs and dystopias, she probably refers to the hieroglyph project that was started in 2011 by Neil Stephenson, a well-known science fiction writer, where the purpose is to create, to encourage, to augment the creation of science fiction, which will help in the innovation of science and technology, which will be relevant for the future of humanity. In fact, she concludes through various references to texts and other things that the dystopian condition like 1984 is already there now, and it is the science fictional creativity that might allow us to experience a better thing. Because she also asserts that the future is not merely in the future, but it is very much there today itself. It is very much here. She quotes William Gibson by saying that the future is already there now. So let us hope that these two talks will inspire our participants to take a more serious and a more creative perspective of science fiction and its studies. So all the best for the participants, and I am very grateful once again for the Bangalore University, which is my alma mater too, to have organized this conference and making it possible. Thank you one and all.